Anyway, Paul and Dia, we've spent literally the past 24 hours with the Soviet journalists as they cover the summit here, and if anything stands out, it's not only the concern they have over what happens here at the summit, but the concern they have over the problems they face at home. The people there are increasingly discontent with many of the changes that have resulted from Gorbachev's economic reforms. But there have indeed been many other changes since Gorbachev rose to power in 1985, and that includes the way the Soviet journalists handled their stories.
Well, you don't hear me because no one told me that.
We've got 10 correspondents here.
Do you have audio from all three mics?
Tell them to stand by. We'll fix it.
Yeah, you're on.
Well, as far as I know, the administration is not ready to go.
He's seen by millions of people in the Soviet Union every night. But at Andrews Air Force Base, Leonid Zolotoyevsky is just another face in a sea of reporters preening before the cameras that will transmit Gorbachev's arrival here to the world. It seems especially significant in light of the troubled times his country faces.
Many people, just cannot make a real political judgment. They go to the shops, see the shelves, empty with no sausage or some other foodstuff. They get angry.
Leonid is a veteran Soviet journalist, but his candor represents a new approach to Soviet journalism. 11 p.m. The Soviets sit down for an editorial meeting. The sun has already risen in Moscow, and as they map out their strategy for the day, tension runs high. What we need here, one engineer says, is someone who can see what's necessary, somebody who's got his head on straight and can give orders. By mid-morning, the first floor of their hotel has been transformed into a high-tech broadcast center. In a flurry of signals and commands, the Soviets transmit live coverage of the summit to Moscow. Other journalists prepare stories that will be transmitted later in the day. Renowned Soviet journalist and former American Vladimir Posner voices a story about racism in parts of Washington. They don't bring tourists here, his narration begins, and that's a pity, because it's not only a different city, it's a different world here. Though his criticism is sharp, Posner is equally quick to criticize the Soviet Union. It hasn't always been that way.
How has Soviet journalism changed?
It's, you wouldn't recognize it. It's amazing, in fact. Journalists seem to have been the first people ready for glasnost. It changed overnight. It became extremely hard-hitting, absolutely open, frank, very profound, which doesn't mean that we have total freedom, and I don't think anyone does. But just to give you one
5 years ago, Posner says, there was no such thing as journalism in the Soviet Union. But that's no longer the case, he says, even if that means criticizing the man who made it possible.
Now, Paul and Di, that new philosophy also extends to the way the Soviets view the summit and how it impacts President Gorbachev. They say in the long run it will better relations with the United States and improve his image abroad. But it doesn't do much for the more immediate problems in the Soviet Union. In other words, when he returns to Moscow, there's still going to be no food on the shelves, and the people are still going to be discontent. Paul, Di?
Brad, were you able to learn anything today about how the Soviet journalists feel about the trip to Minnesota, perhaps a trip to California, and also their coverage plans for their journey here?
Actually, that's very interesting. The Soviet journalists with whom I spoke all indicated that it was a mystery. They said if Gorbachev plans to meet with agriculture and business leaders, why not go to someplace like Chicago or even New York, and they could go there to meet him. So they really have no definite answers as to why he's coming to Minnesota, and I think it will be as much a surprise to them as it is to us.
All right. Thank you very much, Brad.
Spokojny noc.
And Pat Miles and Brad Woodard will continue their live coverage from the summit tomorrow on KARE 11 News.